I know y'all must have heard something about Tower of Fantasy by now, whether it be from all the social media ads or the Genshin fans screaming about how their game got ripped off. Although, wouldn't that be a copy of a copy? Cause y'all were saying the same thing about Genshin and Breath of the Wild not too long ago, and I see the foot is on the other shoe now, huh? But today we gotta talk about Tower of Fantasy because it's definitely not the game I wanted it to be. But it does serve a really good purpose, so I wouldn't count it out just yet. First, let's tackle the elephant in the room and just say it now. They totally took a lot of inspiration from Genshin. Just look at the characters Shirley and Mia. You mean to tell me that this ain't the Traveler and Paimon? Like, did the people at Hoda Studio just isekai them? And trust me, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because there's clearly a lot of stuff here that's similar to Genshin, but I'd argue that it's not much of a crime to do that, because we did end up saying the same thing about Genshin and Breath of the Wild, but I felt more like Genshin was able to fill that void of emptiness. The feeling that comes from finishing Breath of the Wild, where you've done all the quests and there's not much left to do. You still have the open world, the exploration, and the cool characters, but now in a story that keeps going as time moves forward. Hell, even recently, Genshin released a whole new area to the game, with even more missions to do and waifus to unlock. So yeah, saying it's a clone is kind of an empty statement if you ask me. But Tower of Fantasy on the other hand, you might have a point there. One thing in particular about Tower of Fantasy that caught my eye is the character customization. I saw people literally creating Genshin characters in this game and it is pretty cool. You have characters like Hu Tao and Yelan, and even 2B is here. It makes the game feel less like a clone and more like another take on the open world RPG genre. Because instead of you rolling for waifus, you just make them yourself. And look, there's even a slider to customize the titties. The game is already looking better than Genshin with this addition alone. But what I love about this game is that it feels less focused on trying to sell you characters, but instead it wants to sell you the weapons. And you might ask, how does that make anything different if they want me to bust out my wallet anyways? But the great thing is that you get to make your character and keep playing as them the whole time. In Genshin, when you roll for characters, that's under the assumption that you'll even be using them after you get them. There are so many characters that I've rolled for, but I never actually get to play as because, well, it's a full-time job just leveling them up. The amount of grinding I have to do to make these characters viable against my level 90 enemies is crazy. To the point where Genshin is all I will be playing for a few months just to get all my best units to the proper levels. But in Tower of Fantasy, it doesn't seem like you have to worry about that at all. As long as you level up one character properly, then you're pretty much set throughout the game. If you think to yourself, I could really use a water weapon to fight these guys, you don't have to switch to a whole nother character and hope they're at the right level. You just swap your weapons and then you don't need to worry. Meanwhile, here I am wanting to power up Yelan as my water unit, but needing an ass load of materials just to ascend her. There's a few things like this that I think makes Tower of Fantasy a good rival to Genshin. Because a part of me feels like Mihoyo is doing a bit too much, and they have their heads a little too far up their asses at times. Don't get it twisted, I do love the games they create, and I'm even looking forward to playing Zenless Zero whenever I get an actual chance to get a code. But the Genshin community is always talking about how they're given scraps of primo gems and materials. For all the gems you need to power up your characters to their absolute best potential, there's no way in hell you can make that happen without spending a bag. Meanwhile, I open up Tower of Fantasy for just the first few hours and I am showered with a ridiculous amount of items and currency off the bat. It does make me feel like this is more of a true mobile game, but I think it's better to be generous with the items because it pulls me into wanting to play it even more. But one thing I will be critical about is how Tower of Fantasy just isn't polished whatsoever. There's a ton of mistakes in the voice acting and subtitles.
Fine. I'll go fix this spacecraft and come back to this later.
Not to mention moments where there's clearly supposed to be voice acting, but then it just stops for one line of the dialogue and then continues right back again.
If everything's fine, you can still go to the festival tonight.
Oh, and not to mention that the game has a lot of graphical errors too. Now, I personally haven't experienced the texture issue, but the official Twitter page is filled with people complaining about it. Plus, I've seen plenty of pop-in where objects just randomly appear and disappear into thin air. Like, yeah, it doesn't totally ruin the game, I'm sure, but they could have at least made sure it was better than this before it came out. Overall, I do think that Tower of Fantasy serves its purpose, and it gives me a chance to see what Genshin could have. Like motorcycles and a jet board, for example. Hell, you can even ride around on a unicorn. And I think it would be awesome to have more modes of getting around in Genshin, especially with them adding new regions year after year. Like, the glider is cool and all, but when you see Tower of Fantasy out here with the jetpacks, it makes you wish that Genshin had something better. If there is anything to take away from this video, it's that over the years, people started to get bored of Genshin. I do my best to play regularly, but there is just not enough to keep me hooked. Outside of the artifact grinding and the material hunting, and even the small events here and there, I have no reason to play this constantly. Maybe that's not such a bad thing since there's always new games coming out that have their own daily rewards and missions too, but sadly, the feeling I had when Genshin first released just isn't there anymore. So that's why a game like Tower of Fantasy is such a pleasant break from the nothingness. It's stepping into yet another open world anime style game with new mechanics to explore. I think that without Genshin starting to bore people, Tower of Fantasy might have been tossed to the side without even a second thought. But this is the best moment for Mihoyo to start thinking about the future of this game, and what people really want out of it besides bleeding everyone's wallet dry for characters. And hey, that also goes for the Tower of Fantasy devs too, because they're one major update away from having the Genshin fans swap back over. And believe me, I would hate to see that happen. Like, sure, it's nowhere close to being a masterpiece, but seeing everyone raving about the game's features brings me back to those early Genshin days. And hell, even to the early Breath of the Wild days too. It's the kind of competition that we needed to light a fire under Mihoyo's ass, so that hopefully we can all get the experience that we deserve from both of these games. But what do you think about Tower of Fantasy? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more videos just like this one, and I'll see you all in the next video.